It was 11:47 at night. I was sitting in my chair, the old leather one by the window, the one I've sat in every night for 30 years, with a book open in my lap that I hadn't actually been reading for the past 20 minutes. My mind had been somewhere else. I couldn't tell you where, exactly. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt like the edge of sleep without actually being it. My phone buzzed on the side table. I picked it up. One message. From Nadia, my daughter-in-law. 3 words. Blue, rain, Sunday. Nothing else. No greeting, no punctuation, no context, no follow-up. Just those 3 words, sitting in the middle of a white screen at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I read it once. I set the phone down, I picked it up and read it again. And then, something happened in my chest. Not panic, not exactly. Something older than panic, something I hadn't felt in years. A particular kind of alertness that I thought I had left behind when I retired. A sharpening, like a lens coming into focus after a long time of being left on a shelf. I was already standing up before I had consciously decided to stand. I put the book down. I didn't mark my page. I didn't care about my page. I walked to the hallway. I put on my shoes. I picked up my keys. I did not call Nadia back. I did not text her to ask what was wrong. I did not stop to think about whether it was too late to drive across town. Because those 3 words, blue, rain, Sunday, were not random. They were not an accident. They were not autocorrect. They were a code. A code that Nadia and I had created together, sitting at her kitchen table 2 years ago on a quiet Sunday afternoon, with cups of tea going cold between us. A code I had prayed, every single day since we created it, that she would never have to use. It meant one thing, only one thing. We had agreed on that, clearly, when we made it. It meant, I need help. I cannot say so out loud. Please come now. Please come quietly. I was in my car in 4 minutes. I drove in the dark, and I thought about my son. I thought about Nadia. I thought about the 2 years that had passed since that Sunday afternoon, and all the things I had watched happening from a careful distance, hoping I was wrong, hoping the distance would close on its own. It hadn't closed. And now, at 11:47, on a Tuesday night, my daughter-in-law had sent me 3 words that meant the distance was gone. My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 61 years old. I spent 28 years working for federal intelligence, reading people, reading situations, reading the space between what was said and what was true. I retired 4 years ago. I thought I was done with nights like this. I was wrong. Let me tell you about my son, James, because you need to understand him properly before you can understand this story. James is 36 years old. He has my height, 6 feet. Just barely, and his mother's dark hair, though it's starting to go at the temples now in a way that, frankly, makes him look more distinguished than I did at his age. He has a laugh that starts slow and then takes over his whole face. He has the kind of stubbornness that can be either his greatest asset or his most serious flaw, depending entirely on what he's being stubborn about. When James was 7 years old, he decided he was going to build a treehouse in the backyard. I told him he could, and that I would help him if he asked. He didn't ask. He spent 3 weekends dragging wood from the garage, hammering nails in ways that were structurally inadvisable, and constructing something that looked less like a treehouse and more like a question mark suspended in an oak tree. When he was done, he stood back, looked at it, and said, "I think it needs one more thing." I said, "What does it need?" He said, "A door." I said, "James, it doesn't have walls yet." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "The door comes first. Then I'll know where the walls go." I've thought about that moment many times over the years. It tells you almost everything about James. He leads with the thing that matters most to him, the entrance, the welcome, the opening, and figures out the structure later. It's a beautiful quality, and a maddening one. His mother, my wife Eleanor, who passed away 8 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for, always said that James got his heart from me and his head from her, and that the combination was either going to make him extraordinary or get him into serious trouble. She was right on both counts. James started his construction company at 29 with money he'd saved over 6 years of working for other people's firms, learning everything he could about how buildings go up and how businesses either do or don't stay standing. He was good at it. He had an eye for structures, a gift for managing people, and enough stubbornness to push through the early years when most small businesses quietly give up. By the time he was 32, he had 14 employees, a reputation for finishing on time and on budget, and 2 contracts with a regional developer that were going to keep him busy for 3 years. He was, by any reasonable measure, doing well. And then he met Nadia. I want to tell you about Nadia carefully because she deserves to be described carefully. She is 33 years old. She came to this country from Eastern Europe at 19, with 2 suitcases, a university acceptance letter, and a determined precision about her that I recognized immediately as the particular quality of someone who has learned early that things don't come easily and has made their peace with that fact. She got her undergraduate degree in 3.5 years while working 20 hours a week at a hotel front desk. She got her master's in urban planning the year after that. She now works for a city planning department, reviewing proposals for housing developments, which is, when you think about it, almost cosmically appropriate, given that she married a man who builds things. She speaks 4 languages. She makes pierogi from scratch on winter Sundays, a recipe her grandmother taught her over the phone from 4,000 miles away. She has a directness that some people mistake for coldness. She says what she means, clearly and without excessive decoration. But once you understand her, you realize that directness is a form of respect. She doesn't waste your time. She doesn't waste words. When James brought her to meet me for the first time, they had been together for 3 months. We sat in my living room and talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, after James had gone to the kitchen to get more coffee, Nadia looked at me and said, very calmly, "You've been watching me analyze him while I talk. You want to know if I'm good for him." I said, "I want to know if you're good for each other." She considered this for a moment. She said, "I think I am. I think he is too. But I think he's going to need someone who doesn't let him hide from hard things. He has a tendency to avoid what's difficult." I said, "He does." She said, "I don't avoid things." I believed her immediately. They got married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in the spring. I walked Nadia down the aisle because her father couldn't make the trip, and I felt, in that moment, something I hadn't expected to feel, a completeness. Like the family that had been missing something since Eleanor died, had found its missing piece in this direct, quietly fierce woman from 4,000 miles away. The first 2 years of their marriage were genuinely good. I saw them often, Sunday dinners, occasional weekdays when Nadia would call and ask if I wanted to come over for something she was cooking. James was busy but present. They argued the way healthy people argue, loudly and briefly, and then completely, with no residue. And then the business started to change. The first sign was a contract that fell through. It was a significant one, a residential development, 42 units, that James had been negotiating for 4 months. The developer pulled out at the last minute, citing financing issues. These things happen in construction. James knew that. He had seen it happen to other people, but he hadn't experienced it himself. Not at this scale, and I watched him absorb it, the way you watch someone absorb a physical impact. The initial stillness, the recalibration, the attempt to project normalcy. He told me about it over the phone, briefly, and then said he had another call and hung up. 2 months later, a second contract, smaller, but still, ran into legal complications with a materials supplier. Nothing criminal, nothing catastrophic, but expensive. The legal fees alone were going to eat a significant portion of his operating margin for the quarter. And while that was being sorted, work slowed. When work slows, the people who work for you feel it, and two of his best site managers quietly began looking elsewhere. I knew all of this not because James told me, but because I have spent nearly 3 decades in a profession that requires you to understand what's happening around you by paying attention to what isn't being said. James's calls became shorter. His texts became shorter. When I saw him in person, he was physically present, but somewhere else behind his eyes. A quality I recognized from years of watching people carry things they weren't ready to put down yet. I gave him space. This is one of the hardest skills a parent can develop, and I'm not sure I've ever fully mastered it, but I tried. I gave him space because he is a grown man, and because I have learned that unsolicited advice from a father is almost always received as criticism, regardless of the intention behind it, and because I believed, then, that this was something he was going to work through. But I watched Nadia. I watched her because Nadia doesn't hide things the way James does, not from me, at least. She's too direct for that. And what I saw in Nadia over those months was a woman who was working very hard to hold two things at once: her own anxiety about their situation and her belief that James was going to find his way through it. She came to visit me alone one afternoon, a Saturday, about 8 months after the first contract fell through. She said she was in the neighborhood, which I didn't entirely believe but didn't question. We sat in my kitchen, and I made tea, and we talked about her work for a while, and about a book she had been reading, and about a trip she and James had been talking about taking, but hadn't managed to schedule. And then she said, very quietly, "He's drinking more." I put my cup down. She said, I want to be clear, it's not what you might be imagining. He's not drunk, he's not out of control, but he comes home, and he pours himself a whiskey, and then another one, and sometimes a third, and I can see it's not enjoyment. She paused, looking for the right word. It's management. He's managing something. I said, "Has he talked to you about what's happening with the business?" She said, "He gives me summaries, clean ones, the version where everything is difficult but manageable. I don't think he's lying to me. I think he's lying to himself, and I'm getting the same version he gives himself." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Have you told him you're worried?" She said, 3 times, in 3 different ways. He tells me he's fine and then changes the subject. I said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at me. She said, "I don't know yet. I think I just needed to say it out loud to someone who would actually hear it." I said, "I hear it." That was the afternoon I gave her the code. I told her about my work. I don't talk about it often, and I never talk about the specifics, but I told her enough. I told her about the communication systems we used, the simple, memorable signals that meant one thing and one thing only, that could be sent in plain sight without anyone knowing what they meant. I told her I wanted us to have one. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tell me I was being dramatic or that it wouldn't come to that. She understood immediately why I was offering it, and she received it the way a practical, clear-eyed person receives a safety measure, not as a sign that disaster is inevitable, but as acknowledgement that it is possible, and that being prepared is always better than not being prepared. "Blue, rain, Sunday," she said. "If I get those words, I come immediately. No questions, no calling ahead, I just come." She nodded. We drank our tea. We talked about other things. She went home to my son. I spent the next 2 years hoping I would never get that message. The next 18 months were a study in slow change. I've spent most of my professional life watching things change slowly. Slow change is often harder to see than sudden change, which is paradoxically what makes it more dangerous. A sudden change announces itself. A slow change asks you to constantly recalibrate your baseline, and by the time you realize how far you've moved from where you started, You're already somewhere very different from where you intended to be. James's baseline shifted. The James I saw at Sunday dinners, the ones that were becoming less frequent, moving from every week to every 2 weeks to once a month, was a quieter version of my son. Not sad, exactly. More like someone who has turned the volume down on themselves. He laughed less. He spoke less. He ate his food and looked at his phone more than he used to, which I recognized as the modern equivalent of staring at a wall. Nadia, beside him, had developed a particular skill that I recognized and respected, and also found heartbreaking. The skill of managing the atmosphere of a room. She became very good at steering conversation away from topics that might create tension. She became very good at reading James's mood when he walked in the door, and adjusting accordingly. She became, without intending to, the person responsible for the emotional weather of their home. That's an enormous thing to ask of a person. They rarely ask it of themselves consciously. It just accumulates, the way water accumulates in a low place. I tried once more to talk to James. I drove to their house on a Saturday morning when I knew Nadia had a work commitment. Not to go behind her back, but because I wanted James to be able to say things without worrying about her hearing them. I brought bagels, because in my experience, people are always slightly more willing to talk when there's food in front of them. We sat at their kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and I said, "Tell me about the business." He said, "It's fine." I said, "James." Something shifted in his face, a tightening. He said, "It's hard right now. It's been hard, but I'm handling it." I said, "Are you talking to anyone about it? A business advisor?" He said, "I don't need an advisor. I know my business better than any advisor would." I said, "That might be true, but sometimes the people who know something best are the last ones to see it clearly because they're too close to it." He looked at me. Then he said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "Dad, I know you mean well, but I've spent my whole life watching you handle everything quietly and competently and alone, and I'm trying to do the same thing. So please, let me." I sat with that for a moment. He wasn't wrong, exactly. I have handled most things quietly and competently and alone. It's the training. It's the habit. And somewhere along the way, I had passed that habit to my son, without intending to. The way parents pass so many things to their children without intending to, not through instruction, but through example. I said, "The difference is that I didn't have someone at home watching me do it. You do." He was quiet. I said, "Nadia sees you, James. All of you. Not the summary version, the real version, and she's carrying what she sees. Alone, because you're carrying everything else alone. That's 2 people alone in the same house. That's not a marriage. That's 2 parallel silences." He didn't say anything. I ate my bagel. He ate his. We talked about other things. I drove home. 6 months passed, and then blue, rain, Sunday. The drive took 17 minutes. It is a 12-minute drive under normal circumstances. I was not driving under normal circumstances. I want to tell you what goes through a person's mind in 17 minutes when they've received a message like that, because I think it matters. I think the inside of those minutes is part of this story. For the first 3 or 4 minutes, I ran through scenarios. This is training. It's automatic, like breathing. What are the possible situations she could be in? What is the most likely? What is the worst case? What do I need to be prepared for when I arrive? The scenarios ranged from difficult to serious. None of them were good, but I had learned long ago that imagining the worst case isn't the same as expecting it. It's just preparation. You make room in your mind for the worst thing so that if you encounter it, you're not meeting it for the first time. For the next few minutes, I thought about James. I thought about the 7-year-old who built a treehouse backwards, door first. I thought about the 12-year-old who cried, silently and alone in his room, for 3 nights after his dog died. and only told me about it weeks later, almost by accident. I thought about the 16-year-old who failed his driving test twice and never mentioned it to anyone. I only found out because the instructor called me to apologize for some administrative error. James had simply waited, retaken the test, passed, and never brought up the failures. He has always done this, processed privately, revealed selectively, carried things until they became too heavy, and then carried them further. Eleanor used to say that James learned to be strong before he learned that strength isn't the same as silence. She was right. She was usually right. I thought about Nadia, her coat on inside her own house, calculating exit routes without even fully realizing she was doing it. I thought about 2 years of Sunday codes sitting in the back of her mind, unused, and what it cost her to finally use it. It cost something, asking for help. It always costs something. The people who ask anyway are braver than the ones who never need to. For the last few minutes of the drive, I thought about what I was going to do. Not the dramatic version, not some confrontation, not some explosion of finally said truths. That's not how things actually work. Real situations require presence first, assessment second, response third. You don't decide what to do before you know what you're walking into. But underneath the procedure, underneath the training, there was something simpler. I was going to my family. That was all. Whatever was needed when I got there, I would provide. Because that's what you do. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Not the career, not the decades of training, not any of it. You show up for the people you love. I parked one house down from theirs. Old habit. I turned off my headlights before I turned off the engine. I walked to the front door in the dark. I knocked 3 times, then 2. Nadia and I had never explicitly agreed on that pattern. I'm not entirely sure why I did it. Maybe because it felt right. A signal within a signal, a way of saying it's me, specifically me, and I came. 30 seconds, 40. Then the door opened. Nadia was standing in the hallway light, and she was wearing her winter coat. Inside the house, at midnight, her coat fully on, and the sight of that coat told me more than any words could have. She had been thinking about leaving. She hadn't decided to leave. She had sent for me first, which meant she was hoping she wouldn't have to. But the coat was her insurance policy. The coat was just in case. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she stepped back. I came inside. I stopped in the hallway, and I did something that would have looked strange to anyone watching, but which was completely automatic. I stood still, and I listened to the house. A house has a particular quality of sound when it's just one person in it, a different quality for 2. I have spent years learning those qualities and the variations between them. 2 people. James was home. I could hear, faintly, from upstairs, music. Low, indistinct. The kind of music you put on when you want sound without wanting to hear anything. Nadia led me to the kitchen. She closed the door. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface, which is something people do when they need to feel something solid underneath them. I sat across from her. I said, quietly, "Tell me," and she did. She started at the beginning, which is not where most people start when they're frightened and exhausted. But Nadia is not most people, and her precision, even under pressure, is one of the things I have always admired about her. She went in order. She told me things I knew and things I didn't know, and she told them to me without editorializing, without performing distress, in the calm, flat voice of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally found a place to set it down. She told me about the last 8 months. The drinking, which I had known about in outline but not in detail. The detail was harder to hear than the outline had been. A glass, then 2, then 3, then sometimes a 4th before he came to bed. Not violent, not falling down. A slow, steady application of alcohol to something that wouldn't quiet any other way. She told me about the arguments, small ones always. They started over nothing, which is how the real arguments always start, because the real argument is never about the thing it appears to be about. Dishes, temperature, scheduling, something she said wrong or he heard wrong. But underneath them, something that was getting larger and darker and harder to pretend wasn't there. She told me about the words. I will not repeat them here. She told me what he had said, not tonight only, but over the past several months, in the worst moments of the worst arguments. I listened to all of it. I kept my face still and my breathing steady, which took more effort than I would like to admit. And she told me about tonight. James had come home at 9:30. He had been at a meeting that had apparently gone badly. She wasn't sure of the details. He didn't share them. He came in without speaking, went directly to the kitchen, poured a drink, and stood at the counter, drinking it with his back to the room. She had said something. She couldn't even remember exactly what. Something ordinary, asking if he'd eaten, whether he wanted dinner. Something that in any other version of their marriage would have been a completely unremarkable sentence. He had turned around, and what came out of him was not anger at her specifically, she said. She was clear about that, and I believed her clarity. It was anger, looking for a surface to land on, and she was the nearest surface. He said things. She didn't respond to them, which she had learned was usually the safest approach. But tonight, her silence made it worse, and not better. And the things he said escalated until they reached a place that she said, quietly, felt like a line, not a physical line. She said that clearly, but a line. After that, he had gone upstairs. She had stood in the kitchen alone for 20 minutes. Then she had picked up her phone and typed 3 words. When she finished telling me, the kitchen was very quiet. I looked at my daughter-in-law. This woman who had come 4,000 miles with 2 suitcases and built herself a life through sheer precision and will. This woman who made pierogi on winter Sundays and spoke 4 languages and had married my son because she believed in him and was now sitting across from me at midnight with her coat on, because she wasn't sure she could stay. I said, "You were right to call me." She looked at her hands. I said, "Nadia, look at me." She looked up. I said, "You will always be right to call me. Do you understand that? Always." She nodded. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. The particular expression of someone who has been waiting to hear something for a long time and has finally heard it. I said, "I'm going to go upstairs." She said, "Robert," I said, "I know my son, and I think it's time he remembered some things." I went upstairs alone. I knocked once, firmly, not politely, and opened the door without waiting. James was sitting on the edge of the bed, jacket still on, like he'd sat down and then not been able to find a reason to stand back up. A glass on the nightstand, half empty. His phone face down beside it. The music I'd heard from downstairs was coming from a small speaker on the dresser, something low and instrumental, the kind of music that fills silence without requiring attention. He looked up when I came in. For 1 second, just one, he looked like a child who has been caught doing something he knew was wrong. I have seen that expression on his face maybe 5 or 6 times in his life, and it always does the same thing to me. It reminds me that inside every adult is every version of themselves they have ever been, all at once, and sometimes the youngest version is the one that surfaces first. Then the adult reassembled. His face closed. He said, "Dad, what are you?" I said, "Nadia called me." A flash of something. Anger, or the cousin of anger. She had no right to. I said, "Stop." 1 word. I don't use that tone often. I used it perhaps a dozen times in my entire career, and each time I used it the room went quiet in a particular way. It went quiet now. James stopped. I walked to the corner of the room, and I picked up the chair that was there and I carried it to the center of the room, and I sat down, deliberately, taking my time, because sitting down says, I am not leaving, I am not rushing, I am here for as long as this takes. I said, I'm going to talk, you're going to listen. When I'm done, you can say everything you need to say, but right now, you are going to listen to me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned back slightly. Not agreement. James doesn't concede that easily, but acknowledgement. Go ahead. I said, I'm going to start by saying something that I should have said months ago, and I didn't, and that's on me. I saw what was happening. Not all of it. I didn't know the specifics, but I saw the shape of it, and I chose to give you space to handle it yourself, because you are a grown man, and because you asked me to. I respected that request. I'm not sure anymore that I was right to. He started to say something. I held up one hand. Not yet. I said, the business. I know it's been hard. I know the last year has been the hardest year of your professional life. I know that you have been carrying financial pressure and legal pressure and the pressure of being responsible for the people who work for you, and I know that none of that has been small. I'm not going to minimize it. He was watching me. Some of the tension in his shoulders had shifted, not gone, but changed in quality. I said, but here's what I need you to hear. The business is a problem. It is not the problem. The business is something that can be addressed, restructured, reduced, rebuilt, whatever it needs. Businesses fail and recover. They close and open differently. I have watched people lose everything professionally and come back from it. It happens. It's survivable. I paused. I said, what is not automatically survivable is what is happening in this house. What is happening between you and your wife? His jaw tightened. I said, I'm not here to take sides. I want to say that clearly. Nadia is not perfect. No one is perfect. And this is not a simple story with a villain. You are not a villain, James. You are a man who is in pain and who has not found a way to put that pain somewhere that isn't his marriage. He looked at the floor. I said, I know this because I recognize it. I recognize it specifically. When your mother was sick, the last 2 years, the difficult ones, I did the same thing. I carried everything alone because that's what I knew how to do. I managed the medical appointments and the insurance and my work and the house and your school and all the logistics, and I told myself I was protecting her, protecting you. And what I was actually doing was disappearing, being present in every practical way and absent in every real one. And your mother, who was braver and more direct than I have ever been, sat me down one Sunday and said, Robert, I need you here, not the managed version, you. James looked up. I hadn't told him that before. I had never told him that. I said, she was dying, and she had to ask me to actually be present with her. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Not with guilt. I've made my peace with it. But as a lesson. As the lesson, maybe. The room was very quiet. I said, Nadia is not dying. She is very much alive, and she is your wife, and she loves you. But she is standing in a kitchen, downstairs at midnight, wearing her coat. James! Inside the house. Her coat. He closed his eyes. I said, do you understand what that means? He said, very quietly, yes. I said, she sent me a code I gave her 2 years ago, an emergency signal. She used it tonight. That is where things are. He opened his eyes. You gave her a... Yes. You set that up without telling me. I set up a safety net, because I love my son, and I know that good men sometimes lose themselves, and I wanted to make sure that if that happened, someone could get to her. He was silent for a long moment. I said, I'm not asking you to be someone different. I'm not asking you to stop being private or self-sufficient or strong. I'm asking you to recognize that those qualities, without any softness in them, become walls. And your wife is on the other side of a wall right now, reaching through it the only way she could figure out how. I leaned forward. I said, "Tomorrow morning, you are going to call a therapist. Not because I'm telling you to, because you've been sitting in this room for the last hour, already knowing you need to, and I'm just saying it out loud, so you can't pretend you don't know." He didn't argue. I said, "Tonight, you are going to go downstairs, and you are going to say sorry to your wife. Not explain, not justify, not give her the context and the reasons and the mitigating factors, just, 'I am sorry.' And then, you are going to let her decide what she does with that." He stood up. He looked at me for a moment, my son, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was very young, since the earliest years, when he still looked to me to confirm that things were going to be all right. He said, "Are you going to stay?" I said, "For a while." He nodded. He walked to the door. Then he stopped. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry I made you drive here at midnight." I said, "Don't apologize to me. Go downstairs." I followed James downstairs a few minutes later, giving him time alone with Nadia first. When I came into the kitchen, they were sitting across from each other at the table. Not touching yet, but facing each other. Eyes open. That's not nothing. That's actually everything, sometimes. Just being willing to face each other. I sat at the far end of the table, quietly. Nadia looked at me. She said, "There's something else." James looked at her. She reached into her coat pocket. She was still wearing the coat, I noticed, but differently now, not like armor, like something she had forgotten to take off. She put a folded piece of paper on the table. James went very still. I said, "Nadia, what is this?" She said, "I found it 3 days ago, in the desk. I was looking for the car insurance documents. Completely ordinary reason. And I found this, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to bring it up. And then tonight happened, and it's connected. I think it's all connected." I picked up the paper. I unfolded it slowly. It was a letter, handwritten, on clinical letterhead, from a neurologist, a specialist, at a medical center in the city, dated 6 weeks ago. I read it once. I read it again. I have read a great many documents in my life. Reports, assessments, intelligence briefings with very high stakes. I have learned to read quickly and absorb completely, and respond with composure. This letter required all of that, and more. It was a letter summarizing the outcome of an appointment James had attended 6 weeks ago, alone, without telling Nadia, without telling me. It referenced a series of tests. It referenced the results of those tests. And it referenced a diagnosis. Early stage, the letter said. Still early stage. A degenerative neurological condition, one that progresses slowly, that responds well to early intervention, that with proper management allows for many years of largely normal function. But a condition that, the letter was careful to note, presents in its early stages primarily as changes in mood, impulse control, and emotional regulation. I read that line 3 times. Changes in mood, impulse control, emotional regulation. I sat at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, and I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. He had known what the letter said before I picked it up. He had known for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of carrying a diagnosis alone. 6 weeks of sitting with this knowledge and not knowing what to do with it, how to say it, where to put it. 6 weeks of watching himself change in ways he could feel but couldn't fully explain, and not being able to say, "Here is the reason, here is the explanation, here is why I am not entirely myself right now." 6 weeks of being afraid. The drinking that was self-medication. The anger that was terror. The silence that was not stubbornness but helplessness. All of it rewritten, in an instant, by one letter from a neurologist that my daughter-in-law found behind the car insurance documents. I looked at Nadia. She was watching James. James was very still. I said, "James?" He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time. and has finally been seen holding it. Not relief yet. Something earlier than relief. The moment just before relief, when you're not sure yet whether putting something down is allowed. I stood up. I walked around the table to my son, and I put my arms around him. This man who is taller than me by 2 inches now, and has been since he was 16. And I held on. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, into my shoulder, with the voice of someone much younger than 36. I didn't know how to tell you. I said, I know. I said, you should have, but I know. I said, you are not doing this alone. Do you hear me? Not one more day of this alone. That night changed the direction of everything. Not instantly. Real change is never instant. It's a series of small decisions, made daily, in the direction of something better. But the direction changed. That night, at that kitchen table, the direction changed. The next morning, James called the neurologist. He made a proper appointment. Not alone this time. Nadia went with him. She sat beside him in the doctor's office and asked the questions that James couldn't always form, and James answered the ones she couldn't. And between the two of them, they came home with a treatment plan, a monitoring schedule, and something that had been completely absent from their house for months. A shared understanding. He called a therapist the following week, someone who specialized in men dealing with health diagnoses, a specific kind of grief, the therapist told him, learning that your future is different from the one you had planned. James went every week. He still goes. The drinking stopped. Not overnight. That's not how these things work. But it became less, and then less again. And then one day, Nadia noticed that the whiskey bottle had been in the cabinet, untouched, for 3 weeks. She told me about it quietly, like a piece of good news, too fragile to say too loudly. The business, some of it was saved, and some of it wasn't, and that turned out to be all right. A smaller version exists today. James says it's the right size. He says he can see all of it from where he stands, which means he can actually see it, rather than managing a machine that had grown past his ability to observe. He apologized to Nadia, many times, in many ways. Specifically, in the way that apologies only mean something when they're specific, not, I'm sorry for how I was, but naming the exact moments, the exact words, the exact things he should not have said. She received each one carefully, on her own timeline. She is not a woman who forgives quickly or cheaply. She forgave him thoroughly, which is different and worth more. About 5 months after that night, James and I were sitting in my kitchen, the same chairs, the same table, 2 cups of coffee between us, and he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, I keep thinking about the coat. I said, what about it? He said, she was wearing her coat inside the house. At midnight. I didn't know that, she told me later. And I think about, if you hadn't come, if she hadn't sent the code, if she just stood in that kitchen alone, another hour, and then made a decision. I said, but she sent the code. He said, because you gave it to her. I said, because she trusted me enough to use it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to be someone she doesn't need a code with. I want to be someone she can just say things to, directly, without needing an emergency signal. I said, then be that. He said, I'm trying. I said, I know you are. I can see it, and I could. That's the thing about watching someone closely for a long time. You see the real changes when they happen, not the performed ones. The real ones are quieter. They show up in small moments, in the way James answers Nadia's questions now, fully, without the clean summary version. In the way he calls me sometimes, just to talk, not for any particular reason, not with anything specific to report, just to talk. He never used to do that. He does now. I want to leave you with a few thoughts, because I think this story is about more than one family's difficult year. I think it's about the codes we give each other, Not necessarily three-word text messages, though I genuinely believe every person should have something like that with someone they trust. But the broader idea. The signals we create between ourselves that say, if you ever need me, here is how to reach me. Here is how to say so without saying so. Here is the door I will always open. My son carried a medical diagnosis alone for 6 weeks because he didn't know how to say it. My daughter-in-law carried the weight of a marriage in trouble for months because she didn't want to be a burden. 2 people, alone in the same house, drowning in adjacent silences. The code cracked it open, 1 text message, 3 ordinary words, but the code only worked because the trust existed before it was needed. Nadia sent it because she believed I would come. She believed I would come because I had told her, clearly, that I would. The words were nothing without the relationship behind them. This is what I've learned, not from intelligence work, not from years of reading people and situations, but from being a father-in-law, a widower, a man who has made more mistakes in love than in anything else. The most important things you can say to the people you love are not the big things, not the declarations, not the milestone speeches. They are the small, specific, practical things. Here is how to reach me. Here is what I will do when you do. Here are 3 words that mean, I trust you with my worst moment. Those things take 5 minutes to say. They can change everything. If there is someone in your life tonight, a daughter-in-law, a sister, a friend, a mother, who you think might one day need a quiet way to reach you, reach out to them first. Create something simple. Make the offer. Say, I am here, and here is how to tell me when you need me to be. You may never get the message, but if you do, 3 words at 11:47 at night can change the entire direction of a family. Blue, rain, Sunday. I'll see you in the next one.